Kia ora koutou. So I'm Dr. C from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm the task leader of the How to Reach Energy Users task. And yes, almost 15 years with the various inclinations of the Users Technology Collaboration Program. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to see you. It's obviously not the middle of the night because I'm actually in my birth country, Austria, today. But yeah, I crack right in. We're going to talk about unintended consequences today, which is obviously a very interesting topic for all of us who are designing interventions to do with the just transition. Just very quickly want to point out that I am not speaking on behalf of the IEA Secretariat, but that the users TCP is functionally and legally autonomous from them. And now for some reason I can't go further. I'm going to give a very quick background to the How to Reach Energy Users task, a summary overview of the findings from phase one, especially how they may pertain to unintended consequences. I'm going to lay some groundwork around energy equity and justice issues, give an insight into the early findings of phase two, especially around characterizing hidden energy users, and then spend the majority of the talk on our recent publication into unintended consequences. I have to give a shout out first to our amazing array of funders and national experts who you can see here in purple, our project partners in green, and some of the many co-funders and collaborators for field research and pilots in gray, and also scientists and energy hardship experts from all over the world here in orange that have provided us with in-kind feedback and survey responses and advice, and we'd like to acknowledge and thank them all here. So very quickly, because definitions and terminology is important, we have a very broad definition for hard to reach energy users on purpose, because most people think of them as low-income households who live in energy poverty, but it's a lot more complex than that. Vulnerable households are not just those who are low income, but also those who suffer from various intersectionalities. And then there are also high income energy users and high consumers. There are commercial and residential renters and the landlords, and especially small and micro businesses. All of them are hard to reach for different reasons, and we're really talking about a huge number of energy users here. The image here comes from a paper by Sequeira et al., who built on our 2020 characterization of hard to reach energy users by using Eurostat data. And so one of the things we found that was quite shocking to us initially was that those users are significantly greater than what we initially hypothesized, especially if you look at residential and commercial around the world. They're very diverse cohort, and being low income, as I said, doesn't necessarily mean that they are hard to reach. Top-down designed behavior change interventions that are aimed at poorly characterized energy users have several methodological failings, and we published several papers looking into those, particularly a lack of participatory co-design processes with community actors, and also evaluation is always an issue around behavior change processes. End user needs and their lived experiences are often poorly understood by intervention designers because we often operate from very Eurocentric worldviews and also class privileges and cultural biases. And so the involvement of community middle actors, gatekeepers, and navigators is really crucial, but it's also extremely hard because they're overworked, they're undervalued, they suffer from similar levels of distrust in well-meaning experts like us when it comes to how we acknowledge them and their communities' data stories, and especially suffering. So we've got to be very careful there. So are they really hard to reach? Yes. Identifying and recruiting them is extremely hard. We've been doing it for 6 years in field research, and I can tell you it is almost impossible. For example, we did some research for Uplight on small to medium businesses. We sent out over 20,000 emails to small businesses in the US. And we managed to achieve 20 interviews, of which half of them were by word of mouth and, recruited through already established relationships. And they got $200 for like a 40-minute interview. So it wasn't the incentive that wasn't working. It was just that they're really hard to reach. In the non-residential sector, industry needs to do more to not just engage commercial and industrial energy users, but really work with those small to medium and especially micro businesses as well, and also the municipality, university, schools and hospital sector. And in the residential sector, it's almost impossible to reach those vulnerable energy users unless you have trusted relationships with those community navigators who, as I said, are also extremely hard to reach. So those relationships really need to be built. Generally, a lack of trust and low energy literacy, and that includes the small business sector, for sure, are the biggest barriers that we found. The current engagement process approaches like massive campaigns or surveys really just don't work for hard to reach energy users. And for them, it's not really about awareness or willingness. It's actually about survival and these choices, heat or eat or pay rent. And, we really got to do better if we want to include them in a truly just energy transition. So from phase one, we got 4 headline recommendations, and they really kind of follow through in what we found with the unintended consequences work as well. It's really important that we need to listen and understand situations first, and then fix and come up with strategies and solutions. So if we really want to help those who suffer the most and who need urgent interventions, we need to ask them and their trusted support groups in their communities how this help should be offered, because otherwise we're just offering more band-aid solutions, ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, or worse, mass, freezing homelessness, excess winter deaths or summer deaths too now, even in our Western societies, and we're already seeing that. This is probably the single most important lesson we learned, and I can't keep repeating it often enough. It's really important to engage those community and frontline navigators and middle actors, but it is extremely difficult to do. And we really need to get out of our silos and ivory towers and build those trusted relationships with them. And it's very important to acknowledge that they are incredibly underpaid, overworked, and undervalued by society, and that we do, whatever additional burden we place on them, need to very carefully consider that and adequately recompense them for it. We also need to acknowledge that there's inherent justice in the system, both the energy system and the energy research system, because our standards of professionalism are obviously heavily defined by Eurocentric culture. We've institutionalized both whiteness and Westernness as normal and superior in the energy system. And so it's hard to accurately characterize or define our audiences if our gender, ethnicity, or class status means that we don't have a lot of insights into or understanding of the lived experience. And, it's really the same with our energy research system. It's white, male, middle class dominated, Western dominated. We've followed silver bullet solutions presented by engineers and economists and technologists. There's nothing wrong with those disciplines, but, it hasn't really brought us to a more fair and equitable and clean energy system yet. And unfortunately, social scientists and non-Western or otherwise minority experts have received so much less research funding and attention of decision makers. And now in the US and other countries with right-wing governments like in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they're being actively defunded and sometimes even persecuted or fired. And so this attack on woke research like the humanities and social science is really reaching crisis levels, as my good friend, Professor Nicola Gaston, a wonderful physicist in New Zealand, has pointed out in that quote below. We don't really understand how technology works unless we have the social scientists who ask the questions of who we are and why. Finally, it's really important to follow a strong co-design process and not start with the engagement strategy or the design element without having done our homework first. That means spending some time on a landscape and stakeholder assessment to see what's already known and been done, as we've done in this unintended consequence report, which you'll hear more about in a second. And it also is really important that we clearly define our target audiences and behaviors that we want to change, because they're always a lot more complex than what we think or understand. It's also really important to put more time and resources into proper evaluation, including during design and implementation of interventions. For example, our task right now is developing energy behavior program standards with the Canadian Standards Association for both the United States and Canada, and they should come out hopefully towards autumn, like by the end of this year. However, the best way to solve any problem is to remove its cause, and the cause for so many energy users being hard to reach with our business as usual engagement strategies is the energy quadrilemma. And unless we confront this issue head on, we've really got to ask ourselves if there can be a just energy transition for all. So must have heard probably about the energy trilemma. It basically acknowledges that trying to formulate energy policy is complex. The current clear conceptual example of this is via the energy trilemma, where we have those competing forces of economics around affordability and profits, the environment around sustainability and the climate crisis and waste coming from energy, and politics around security and access. And there is no perfect solution, but what society can and should aspire to is achieving a better balance between these three competing aims of energy policy. And to date, arguably, society has focused more on economics to the detriment, particularly of the environment. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine has put energy security in the spotlight, especially here in Europe. Coal output has been rising. That has impacts on our decarbonization efforts, and energy prices have increased. And that, of course, has impacts on energy poverty. And all of that led to the global energy crisis, which was really one of competing priorities. What we haven't looked at is the justice dimensions in this. And so we argue that it's really a quadrilemma, which adds the fourth element, which is that of the social dimensions of energy that focuses on people, our involvement, and the acceptance of decisions in the energy industry and governments. And it deals with both the macro justice issues on societal impacts of energy and how fair it is, how fair and just the institutional decisions really are, as well as micro justice issues, which are how individuals are impacted by systemic outcomes. And so instead of thinking of it as just a fourth leg of the stool, I think we should really apply the energy justice lens to all of our decisions regarding the energy transition, especially in order to avoid unintended consequences. I assume most of you will have also seen this image at some stage. I just want to point out again how important it is terminology-wise to not conflate equality with equity with justice, because they're very different, but they're also, of course, interconnected. And justice is the systemic change that we need to undertake in order to get an equitable system. So energy justice, the key concerns in the field are issues around access, distribution of harms, fairness of decision-making to ensure that the decisions don't infringe on human rights and civil liberties, and also informed participation. And it has several dimensions. Energy burden refers to the expense of energy expenditures relative to the household income. Energy insecurity refers to the hardships that households face when meeting basic household needs. Energy poverty, especially in the European context, usually refers to a lack of access to energy itself. Energy democracy is the notion that communities should have a say and agency in shaping the energy future. Energy sovereignty or recognition justice usually pertains to the right of indigenous communities to have a say over their energy resources, and that's something that we're very interested in this task. Energy future or intergenerational justice issues focus on the long-term implications of energy decisions for future generations. And that really is about the ethics of the decisions that we're making now, informing how our children and grandchildren are dealing with it. And then, of course, energy injustice also has several dimensions. There's economic injustice. For example, low-income households often bear a higher energy cost burden relative to their income if we compare them with middle to high-income households. There is social injustice, which is a lack of access to clean and modern energy services, and that has follow-on effect that can hinder their educational opportunities, healthcare access, overall quality of life, especially in rural and underserved areas. There's environmental injustice, where low-income and minority communities often bear the disproportionate burden of environmental degradation and health impacts associated with polluting energy sources and waste. And then there's spatial injustice, especially rural and remote areas may face challenges in accessing reliable and affordable energy services compared to the urban centres. And I know that because I now live about as rurally as you can at the end of the road in New Zealand, and our power goes out all the time, which I've never experienced living in Wellington. So is a just transition truly possible? I would argue not under the current economic and socio-political system. And so we really need a paradigm shift where the human and environmental justice trump profit thinking. Viewing energy transition initiatives through an energy justice lens will also make it less likely that unintended consequences that harm the most vulnerable will happen. So there is a benefit in doing that. So in our phase 2, we really want to identify, listen to, elevate, and empower priority voices so as to be guided by their experiences, insights, and needs to achieve a truly just energy system transition for all. And the just transition should build energy sovereignty, influence, and resilience in these priority communities. And so priority voices, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on them, are those who are currently hidden, missed, underserved, or intentionally underinvested in by decision makers. Here's an attempt of visualizing the complexity of hidden energy users. As I said earlier, being low income or even vulnerable doesn't necessarily mean that you are hard to reach. And both the difficulty to engage and increasing hardship come into play with that hidden element and energy use demographics. And so this outermost circle that I've highlighted here in purple is really the so-called squeezed middle. It's those energy users who are, who don't have assets like owning their homes, but who are currently really getting squeezed by inflation, cost of living, and high energy prices, but who can't really deal with the stigma of basically becoming the working poor because the utilities are getting so high. And so they have psychological, behavioral, and financial barriers that make it really hard for community, government, and industry stakeholders to support them. However, what's even harder and the bigger issue are actually the next 3 circles of this Dante's Inferno. And we really want to try and help the outer 3 circles from slipping into these segments as hardship and hard to reachness both compound. And we have grouped them into 3 subgroups, but there are obviously many intersectionalities between them, and they usually have many of those different things and can't easily be put into boxes. And the last group, we've got to acknowledge they're often quite hard to empathize with, which is maybe why they've been largely overlooked and ignored by both industry and governments. But, all of these energy users should have a basic human right to access to affordable and secure energy. And often they don't. And that means that some of them actually want to remain hidden on purpose. And so what we are now focusing on trying to figure out and characterize, and unfortunately there hasn't been much research done on this, is why these energy users are hidden. So is it because they have been deprioritized or simply not on anyone's radar? For example, home-based micro-businesses who we know very little about, or transitory homeless who are often regarded as, not because they're not bill payers, usually they're not seen as, energy customers. Is it because they don't want to be a burden on society? We've found that especially in field research with elderly or bereaved elderly, or also recent refugees and immigrants. Is it because they're geographically, technologically, or socially isolated? That would refer to remote Indigenous communities, the elderly, or disabled. Is it because they can't engage, maybe because of their language issues, mental health, or other barriers like being single parents and not having the time or spoons to engage with, energy saving campaigns? Or is it because they struggle with stigma, like those squeezed middle, non-home owning populations that are now really feeling the sting and are struggling with the stigma? Is it because we only know the customer, but not the energy consumer? And that really affects those who are living in overcrowded conditions with lots of energy consumers. They may still have a low per capita consumption, but a very high overall consumption. For example, student flatters or large Pacifica families. And or is it because they choose to remain hidden on purpose? Maybe because of often multi-generational trauma, distrust, fear, shame, stigma, past negative experiences with government or industry bodies. And that's that last group that I showed in the slide before. Any other reasons anyone can think of, I would absolutely love to hear more, because we're about to do a whole bunch of research into this. And as I said, there isn't really much out there yet. So what we're planning to do in phase 2 is we're about to have a paper released in Energy Sustainability and Society that addresses our first research question. The report that I'm about to present addresses our second one. The characterization of hidden energy users that I just gave a few kind of like initial thoughts on will become a chapter in Professor Murray Maiskinen's Energy Equity Handbook, which will be published next year. We've already done a participatory co-design process in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with community and frontline navigators, research and government and industry actors, that proposes a national engagement strategy with regional hubs supporting frontline navigators who can access hidden energy users. So hopefully we get that funded, and then it's going to be some really interesting field case study from New Zealand. And finally, we're about to have our second of 3 national expert workshops in Sápmi in northern Sweden, where we listen to Indigenous voices and their experiences with the clean energy transition, because we really want to elevate them as priority voices. So, unintended consequences refer to unexpected or unforeseen outcomes that result from a particular action or intervention, especially those that may contradict the intended goals of the action. This cartoon really sums it up well. An unintended consequence usually comes from the fact that intervention designers think that they operate in a simple or even complicated system, when instead they actually operate in a complex system. Just to illustrate the complexity that hidden energy users have to navigate despite all the well-intentioned support programs and services that are meant to be available to them, here's an example of our New Zealand co-designed workshop centering around Rangimarie, who's a single Māori mother with a disabled child with high energy needs. She lost her house because she couldn't afford to pay her rent and her utility bills anymore. She's now forced to live with her family, who are now also struggling to deal with the increased energy costs. And there's a lot of shame and stigma and stress involved in her life. And so we used our magic carpet for behavior change that we developed over 10 years ago with the task 24 of the IEA DSM, to collectively illustrate in this workshop with over 45 actors from all these different sectors, on how we can illustrate the relationships between different system actors and their interventions and programs, and how difficult it is for vulnerable populations like Rangimarie to navigate them without a trusted navigator to guide them. And so what you can see here is, you can see the 4 main sectors, because research was not even on the same page as anything to do with Rangimarie. So you see the decision makers, which is the various government programs, the providers, which is the various industries, utilities and industry programs, and then the conscience, which is around environmental and social support services, and then the middle actors who actually do energy advice and, install insulation, etc. The little white bits are the various organizations that exist that do have programs. And then the love hearts are indicating where there is actually kind of smooth processes that should be working for her. But the bombs are really the problem, and they are the major barriers and conflicts that Rangimarie would have to overcome to get access to help that is allegedly available to her. And as we did this exercise together, it was very obvious very quickly that no matter how well designed we think interventions are, if you put yourself into the position of somebody like a hidden energy user in a really vulnerable population, it becomes almost impossible for them to access them. So unintended consequences can be grouped into 3 types. They can be unexpected benefits, and a few of our case studies have shown really positive unexpected benefits. They can be unexpected drawbacks, where an unexpected detriment occurs in addition to the desired effect of the policy, and then there can be perverse results, where a perverse effect contrary to what was originally intended happens, or when an intended solution actually makes a problem worse. And that is what we really want to avoid at all costs. There are several unintended consequences frameworks. The original one was created by Merton in 1936. Similar to Murphy's Law, he has the law of unintended consequences, and he describes 5 of them, 5 causes for unintended consequences: ignorance, errors in analysis, immediate interests overriding long-term interests, which I think we all know very well, basic values, which may require or prohibit certain actions, even if the long-term result may be unfavorable. And then these long-term consequences may eventually cause changes in basic values, which we see all the time as well. And then, of course, self-defeating prophecies, or the fear of some consequence, which drives people to find solutions before the problem occurs, and thus the non-occurrence of the problem is not anticipated. The UK government communication service has a useful framework that centers around anticipated, unanticipated, and desirable and undesirable outcomes, and it calls it the in-case framework, that looks actually at a behavioral approach to them. I don't think I have time right now to go through them, but it's a really interesting report, and if you're interested in this topic, I'd suggest you have a look at it. And then suckling it out, recently, and they included, the authors included Professor Ian Suter, who we've interviewed for this research. They released a framework in 2021, and we applied to use this in our case studies here as well, because it's a really useful framework. And it groups unintended consequences on an knowable to unknowable and avoidable to unavoidable axis. And so the unintended consequences near the origin are manageable, and those furthest away are unmanageable. And with knowable, the authors mean that the intervention designer could find out by researching or talking to other experts about potential unintended consequences that could occur, and avoidable means that a negative consequence could be predicted and prevented. And so this is where we'd like to, stay. So the methods for our research was a mixed methods research. Like I said, we did both a landscape analysis and a stakeholder assessment. We did a policy review of 67 energy hardship programs around the world. And then we did a literature review specifically on unintended consequences literature in the energy sector. And then we got survey responses from 122 energy hardship experts around the world, and did 19 in-depth interviews with especially experts in participating countries who were program managers of the case studies that I'm presenting to you now. And we had 6 specific focus areas that we looked at: tariffs, including demand response and demand flex, electrification and decarbonization, retrofits and home upgrades, EVs and EV chargers, general government policy or just transition interventions, and behavior change and education campaigns. So I want to give you some very quick highlights, because I know Sam wants me to crack on, from most of our case studies that we present in depth in our 142-page report. So, if you ever get bored and you really want to know about unintended consequences, it's there. Otherwise, I can send you a 25-page Cliff Notes version of it. And so we're going to start with our North American, Canadian, and US examples. We looked at 3 case studies from Pacific Gas and Electric on their demand response programs. The purpose was to maintain grid reliability and resilience in the summer months. And they had 3 different flavors. And the unintended consequence was one that was problematic, was that there were really high opt-out rates from priority audiences that they actually really were supposed to help. And that was partly due to motivating penalties, such as bill adders, that increased the cost burden on those low-income households. So it's important, a solution would be to offer bill protection, for example. So that was a knowable and avoidable unintended consequence. And then they actually had to terminate the programs, or at least one of the programs, because of a lack of cost effectiveness. And that was because the high cost of the incentives wasn't balanced with the effect of the load reduction in the programs. That is a knowable and unavoidable unintended consequence. ComEd did a voluntary load reduction program rewarding businesses with financial incentives. They also found higher opt-out rates from priority audiences. And one of the things that was really interesting, it was the only one that we found, is a unknowable and unavoidable and thus unmanageable unintended consequence that happened when the regulations changed after the program had already been put in place, and suddenly really onerous reporting requirements were required that most people didn't want to engage in. Again, difficulty to maintaining customer interest is a knowable and avoidable unintended consequence that just requires better intervention design. The Independent Electricity System Operator of Ontario tried to offer funding to support First Nation communities in, northern Ontario, really remote First Nation communities. What they found is that funding that may work for a typical energy efficiency effort will likely not be successful for an Indigenous engagement effort. And ISO found particularly that efforts to reach these First Nation communities really can fall short if continuous funding isn't available, because it takes a long time to build the trust and the relationships. And so if there's uncertainty whether program funding will be available year to year, it's just not going to happen. Another unintended consequence was that when they did find, just the right people in the community to help them create some of those trusted relationships so they even could talk to them, they often pulled them away from more important to them kind of tasks. And so it's really important that you actually hire and recompense properly within the community a dedicated champion. So that is a noble and avoidable, now that they know, unintended consequence. And the fact that building relationships just takes time. And if you don't have the resources, or you don't have the time, or you don't have the funding guaranteed, yes, it's knowable, but it is an unavoidable unintended consequence. Vermont Gas System offered leasing and sale of electric heat pump water heaters to minimize the customer cost burden of electrifying. And then they also later on added centrally ducted heat pump offerings and mini splits. One unintended consequence was that customers still relied on natural gas, and it was especially challenging to encourage them to use heat pumps all year round when during cold winter days, gas was significantly cheaper. So, I mean, that's a knowable but unavoidable unintended consequence. But another one, which is of the clean energy transition in general, is that rising cost of natural gas for those who can't afford to participate in these programs. And so as customers wean off natural gas in pursuit of efficiency projects and electrification, those that will remain, which are usually more low income and renters, more vulnerable, will be burdened by maintaining the natural gas infrastructure. And so in efforts to address this unintended consequences, Vermont Gas has partnered with the state electricity efficiency program to fold their incentives into those sales. So that was a knowable and avoidable unintended consequence that they're working on. This one is truly a tale of tragedies. It was a great initiative. The Biden administration, the White House, directed 40% of overall benefits of a lot of federal investments worth hundreds of billions of dollars to go to disadvantaged communities. But there were several unintended consequences to do with this. Most of them really could be summed up as federal funding just not reaching the impacted intended communities for several reasons. One of them is that there is a huge difference between federal and state laws, and every state has different laws and regulations and different ways of rolling them out. So bringing those communities up to speed before implementation and dealing with the was really held up by the administrative capacity. And so you really needed to develop those regional approaches from the bottom up first. And that, of course, takes time. So the benefits weren't realized immediately. These two were knowable but unavoidable unintended consequences just because of how complex the system is in the United States. Failing to become familiar with communities prior to engagement, that's really a knowable and avoidable unintended consequence, but something that we keep doing, again, because I think we're so used to our Eurocentric approaches that we think we know what's going on the ground, but we really don't. What's the biggest tragedy, and I haven't checked today, but if you plug in Justice 40, it may not even exist on the web anymore. It didn't for a long time, pretty much as soon as the Trump administration started, because they basically threw it all out because it had, the word justice in it. And so what the unknowable and totally avoidable consequence of this will be to all these communities who already had billions and billions of dollars and all these, relationships that have been worked on in the last 4 years, what it means to pull that all away. We are going to see over the next few years. And it was definitely throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we probably have the most perfect example of an unintended consequences with our low fixed user charges that were regulated in 2004 because somebody got into the minister's ear about those poor Queenstown, which is a very rich tourist town, elderly people paying, $1 a day or $2 a day fixed user charges. And so they basically regulated all utilities to offer a low use plan where fixed charges were only 30 cents a day. And that was meant to induce energy conservation. But of course, since then, because of all the efforts that the government has undertaken as well, households were becoming much more energy efficient, but larger households that are not as energy efficient, so those with those, they may have, as I said, per capita low consumption, but have a lot of energy consumers living in overcrowded conditions, or renters who can't do these efficiency interventions that homeowners can, are now paying significantly more and actually subsidizing, rich two-person households who can afford energy efficiency appliances or interventions. And that obviously is a big issue, equity related. There was a midterm review right now undertaken by the government, because what they did is they started phasing them out after the electricity price review in 2019 did uncover all these equity issues. And they found that mostly the phase out is actually working as intended, and there are not too many people who are actually now much worse off than they were before. But for those, especially low income ones who are, the utilities have offered a power credit scheme of $110 twice a year that people can get back if they're really, suffering from the low use rollout. So this is a knowable and avoidable unintended consequence that the government is dealing with. What was more problematic is that we just have such lower energy literacy in our country, including with some of our journalists. A lot of the communication around the low fixed charge phase out in the media was really going about how low energy users are now being penalized for using less energy, and people can see that their utility bills are going up quite a lot. And so there was quite a lot of outrage about this phase out, even though it's meant to be more equitable, but that message just didn't come across that well. What was also really interesting is that this low fixed charge actually completely disincentivized our utility industry and lines companies from being able to implement electrification and decarbonization efforts via, for example, time of use tariffs or demand response stuff. And it also actually disincentivized people from fuel switching to electricity if they had, for example, gas heaters or wood burners. And so these were, yes, knowable and avoidable unintended consequences, but problematic nonetheless. Hopefully the phase out will continue as intended, and these are going to work themselves through the system, and our energy system is going to become decarbonized and electrified more quickly. This is an example from the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority about one of the really successful international insulation and clean heating subsidy retrofit programs, which we've been running since 2009 when I worked there as principal scientist for ICA. The aim was to retrofit almost 400,000 homes, which was about a little under half of the homes that really needed to be retrofitted. And the program was highly successful, with probably the biggest unintended benefit that came out of it being that it was measured, the insulation was measured to have a 1 to 4 macroeconomic health benefits. For every dollar spent, $4 were saved on the macroeconomic health savings, and in the clean heating heat pump one, it was even 1 to 7. So, and the IEA showed this as a case study in the multiple benefits report from 2014. However, one size does not fit all, as they found. And one of the issues when you're trying to just put in insulation or heat pumps into homes that may have, broken windows or, big leaks under doors, etc. And if you can't also then fund those simple repairs, it just doesn't work. That was a knowable and unavoidable unintended consequence, because if the money isn't there for those things, then it can't be done. There was another issue around especially commercial installers just not wanting to go into any areas that were really low income or that they perceived as dangerous. And so they really underserved those communities, which is why it's really important to include those community providers who are also culturally more appropriate for certain communities. And we obviously also found that behaviorally, because the installers didn't really train the people who they installed, for example, heat pumps for, there was some really unintended behaviors that were happening around how the heat pumps were being used, or a lack of maintenance or cleaning that was necessary. One really ironic outcome was when our comms and marketing team did big, mass marketing campaigns with something, unintendedly ironic, which is, talking about using igloos as an example for bad insulation. And that's really a knowable and avoidable unintended consequences. just sending the wrong message. They also had some where they had the doors wide open and talking about insulation in winter with the snow going down. Our electricity authority turned our voluntary customer care guidelines into obligations just in the last month or so. And that was to ensure that our utility industry provides consistent and standard support, especially to medically dependent customers. So some of the unintended consequences that we're fearing, and it's only just started, so we don't know yet, but is that they may, that these customer care obligations still won't reach hidden and hard to reach customers without having those community and frontline relationships that can help. That retailers alone can't overcome the barriers. They need those relationships, and that they may actually stifle innovative and creative solutions that retailers already have implemented. And especially if there are high penalties, that they may backfire, particularly on smaller retailers. Yeah, so these are knowable and unavoidable, and knowable and avoidable unintended consequences, and we need to see how we go. Winter energy payments are happening both in the UK and New Zealand. They're supposed to help elderly energy users with winter energy bills, but they're universal. So they're not targeted. And so what has been found in both countries were that those suffering the most from energy hardship aren't actually eligible for payments because they're targeted towards the wrong demographics. And also that, the universal nature meant that a significant number of households received financial support they didn't need. In the UK, they withdrew a whole lot of them, and now a whole bunch of pensioners that should have gotten them didn't get them. So doing that upfront work on targeting and tailoring can probably really stop you from having those knowable and avoidable unintended consequences. Finally, in New Zealand, we had a ute tax or clean car discount phase out, where the clean car rebates really helped wealthy people get EVs. Equity issues were there. So yes, it should have been targeted better, but then the new government removed them completely, and also the ute tax, which should have been exempted for people living rurally or tradespeople. And the modelling showed that you will probably lose 350,000 fewer EVs on the road by 2030, costing us 3.5 billion of avoided emissions. And the modelling was right. The EV sales have already plummeted by over 74%. So that was a knowable and avoidable unintended consequence. Similarly, in Sweden, we found a big gap in the EV rollout between rural and urban EV adoption. So, making sure that the rural communities aren't being left out is important. They also had an electricity subsidy in response to the energy crisis that, again, had some equity issues, which were knowable and avoidable. And we had some education and behavior change examples from Sweden, where this one was a traveling course that went similar to where we are going now with our workshop to Sapmi, teaching people about, Indigenous insights into the energy transition, but limited reach beyond committed participants meant that it was kind of preaching to the converted, and the Indigenous perspectives, which was knowable and avoidable, but the Indigenous perspectives were also included rather as a storytelling exercise than, co-designing the process. And that, in some ways is unavoidable because it's extremely hard to actually deal with them, because they're reindeer herders and they're usually busy herding reindeer. And finally, there was a energy communication campaign in Malmö that led to a lot of pushback. There was a lot of mistrust and misunderstanding. People felt really defensive the way it was rolled out. There was kind of one size fits all, and people just felt like they were being judged or misjudged, which is knowable and avoidable. And it's really important to make sure that the information is done, the messaging strategy is done right. So our recommendations outlined in the report is that you really need to take a whole system, multi-stakeholder, transsectoral approach to these things. You need to try and anticipate unintended consequences and prevent those that are manageable, address the different needs of different populations, build those trusted relationships, and really create that knowledge, that greater energy knowledge, through inclusion and listening, and providing tailored, consistent, culturally competent communications, reducing barriers to participation for those priority audiences, and equitably resourcing them so that they can engage. And so the final thoughts are that the social context and factors that marginalize certain groups, when we ignore them, seemingly positive policy instruments can lead to unintended adverse effects. Behavioral science, audience messaging and pre-testing and targeting programs at the right audiences can also minimize those unintended consequences. Engaging communities, inclusive decision-making processes can help avoid them, and prioritizing equity in the energy transition is not only, by doing that, it's not only possible for those who are disproportionately harmed by the current energy system to thrive, but also to create more and sustainable and inclusive solutions for us all. And I'm going to leave it here. Thanks for listening so much. And I see that there is quite a lot of questions, which I'll let Sam facilitate.